chapter 14. Thanks, Jeb, for reading that. It's a really exciting chapter. So many things are happening, and I hope you'll find that tonight is a helpful night having a look at the events in this chapter and thinking a bit about discipleship and preaching and ecclesias and how they work. So, before we start, hopefully everyone's got a handout. Did everyone get a handout when they came in? Hopefully you've all got one. Yep. Or do you need one, or have you got one? You need one. Okay. Yes, there's a few spare. Thank you, Josh. So the handout is very simple. There are 4 points on there: preaching the gospel, people converted, ecclesias, and the apostles. So those 4 things are what we'll be looking at tonight. And as a general rule, these 4 things are really helpful to look for in every chapter of the book of Acts, because Acts is all about these things. Think back to Acts chapter 1. Christ has just been raised from the dead, and he says to the apostles, "Go everywhere and preach." So Acts will give us lots of tools and tips about preaching. It also shows us who they converted, individual people, and we'll see them in Acts chapter 14, and those people form the basis of the rest of the New Testament. The rest of the New Testament are letters and documents written to people, to individuals who were converted, by and large, in the book of Acts. So we're introduced to all of these people, and then the letters are written to them. And the next one is ecclesias, or groups of believers. And this one, I think, is really, really important. Think back to Acts chapter 1. There's Jesus, one man, and there's 12 disciples in one place in Jerusalem. But by the time we come to the end of the book of Acts, there are groups of believers all around the Roman world. There are disciples everywhere, and they've formed themselves into very special groups of believers, and they function and behave in a certain way to help each other maintain their faith and keep on preaching. And those groups are first described in the book of Acts, and Acts shows us how these groups should work and what they should be doing. So we'll have a look at that in chapter 14. And the last one there on the list is the apostles. The book of Acts is obviously all about what the apostles did. The first half of the book is mainly about Peter, and the second half is mainly about Paul and what he did. So tonight we'll be looking at Paul in particular and what this man did as a really outstanding example of faith. So keep your eye on the handout, and hopefully you'll have some notes together by the end of our session. Now, I think this class has been, last time looked at Acts chapter 13. Is that right? Hopefully some of you were there. Yes? I wasn't there, unfortunately. But you might remember that Acts chapter 13 describes the first missionary journey of Paul. And maybe you looked at a map, a little bit like this one here. Was there a map? Yes, there was. Good. I'm seeing some nods. And the journey starts here in Antioch. And Paul and Barnabas traveled to the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean Sea. And they preached the gospel here. And then they traveled up here to Turkey, modern-day Turkey today. And if you follow this blue line, which is where they traveled, you can see this green line here, which is leaving Turkey. Does anyone remember what the green line might be talking about? Acts chapter 13. Somebody starts the journey, but they don't finish the journey. Mark leaves, exactly. So at this point here, one of the preachers leaves Paul and he goes back to Jerusalem. And that leaves Paul and Barnabas preaching the gospel in Turkey, and they went north up to this city called Antioch, and they preached the gospel there, and most of Acts chapter 13 is about what happened in Antioch, about what they spoke about in the synagogue in Antioch. So, does anyone remember what happened at the end of the speech in Acts chapter 13? Everyone's convinced, they were baptized, they moved on to the next place? No. They expelled them out of their coast. That's exactly right. So the preaching of Paul was actually very contentious, and they didn't like what they heard. And so when they got to Antioch, they threw them out of town. And Paul leaves, and he moves on to the next place, which is here in Iconium. And that's Acts chapter 14. That's where it starts in verse 1. It came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake that a great multitude, both of the Jews and the Greeks, believed. So back in Antioch, they've gone to the synagogue, they've preached the gospel, the Jews didn't like it, they threw them out, and then Paul and Barnabas go on to the next city, Acts chapter 14, verse 1, and the very first place they go to is the synagogue. Now, think about that for a moment. If I was the preacher in Antioch and I'd just been to the synagogue and I'd spoken there for some time, and I quickly worked out that the Jews hated what I had to say and threw me out of town, when I got to the next town, I probably would not have gone to the synagogue. But Paul does. In Acts chapter 14, verse 1, he goes straight to the synagogue. And almost every place where Paul goes, he goes straight to the synagogue. And he doesn't do that because he likes being beaten up. He does that for a really important reason. He has fixed inside his head, I've got to go to the synagogue and I've got to speak to the Jewish people. So keep your hand in Acts 14. Move across just a few pages to Romans, which is just after the book of Acts. And have a look in chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. This is a letter written by Paul. He writes the letter to the Romans, which is a group of believers who lived in Rome. And this is what he has to say in verse 16. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to every one that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. And Paul has this principle very firmly fixed in his head: preach to the Jews first, then preach to the Greeks. Now, if you come across to chapter 2 of Romans and have a look in verse 9, Paul says the very same thing. Verse 9, he talks about tribulation and anguish upon every soul of man that doeth evil, of the Jew first and also the Gentile. And in verse 10, but glory, honour, and peace to every man that worketh good, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. 3 times he said that. The Jews receive the gospel first. Paul really, really believes that. And that is what he does. Now, if we turn back just a couple of pages to Acts chapter 28, we're given a bit more of a clue as to why it is that Paul really, really wants to speak to the Jews first. It's very important in his head. Verse 20, Acts 28. For this cause, therefore, have I called you to see you and to speak with you, because that for the hope of Israel I am bound with this chain. So wherever Paul goes, he preaches, and the message that he is preaching is the hope of Israel. And that's why he goes to the Jews first. Even though he's in prison here in chapter 28, he gets beaten up in Antioch, he gets beaten up in Iconium, he gets beaten up in all these places. He really wants to speak to the Jews first. So, if you have a look at your Bible here, this is Acts 28 or 14. We're almost at the end of the Bible. All of this section here is about the Jews. It's all about the history of Israel. The whole message of the Bible just about is a Jewish message, and that's why Paul is so keen to speak to the Jewish people first, because he thinks he'll convince them to follow on in their faith. Now let's come back to Acts chapter 14, and let's keep following the story here. Paul goes to the synagogue in Antioch in verse 1, and then in verse 2, we read this: the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and made their minds evil affected against the brethren. So just like in Antioch, the Jews didn't like what they heard, and they start to cause a commotion in verse 2. But in verse 3, have a look at what Paul does. Long time, therefore, abode they, speaking boldly in the Lord, which gave testimony unto his word of his grace, and granted signs and wonders to be done in their hands. Paul keeps on preaching, and he preaches in verse 3 in a way that is described as being very bold. And that phrase, that bold preaching of Paul, is a theme that runs right through the book of Acts. Whenever Paul preaches, he preaches in a very dynamic, persuasive, eloquent way that people are just amazed to hear. He speaks with enormous courage, and he convinces some people to come into the faith. Of course, he infuriates other people, like the Jews, but he speaks very, very boldly and courageously. And right through the book of Acts, that is the way this man's preaching is described. Well, if we look in verse 4, of course, that preaching causes division. A strong message will always polarize people, and that's just what happens in the book of Acts here in verse 4. The city is divided. Part are with the Jews, and part are with the apostles. And have a look in verse 5. There was an assault made of the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to use them despitefully and to stone them. And when they were aware of it, they fled unto Lystra and Derbe. So the same pattern takes place. The Jews hear the message, they hate what they hear, they stir up a commotion, and Paul is driven out of town. In fact, if you have a look in verse 5, we're told that the Jews actually tried to kill Paul. They tried to stone him, and in verse 6, they became aware of it. That's a very sort of abstract way to describe it. Somehow, they discovered that they were about to be killed. And because of that, they quickly leave town, and that saves their lives. Now, if you keep your hand here and come to 2 Timothy chapter 3, there's a really interesting passage here about just this moment in time in Acts chapter 14. Let's remember, the book of Acts is the story of the New Testament, and all of the letters written afterwards connect to the story in the book of Acts. If we come to 2 Timothy chapter 3, in verse 11, it tells us something about what happened in Iconium. So Paul's writing to Timothy, and this is what he says in verse 11. Persecutions, afflictions, which came unto me at Antioch, that's Acts chapter 13, Iconium, that's Acts chapter 14, and at Lystra, that's Acts chapter 14 as well. These persecutions I endured, but out of them all the Lord delivered me. So Paul tells us here that somehow God has saved him back in Acts chapter 14. The hand of providence has been at work so that Paul somehow finds out that they want to kill him and he leaves town. And that pattern follows right through the book of Acts. You might know the story about Paul in Jerusalem. His nephew hears about a plot to kill him. Somehow he finds out, he tells Paul, and Paul is delivered. God's hand of providence is at work all the way through the book of Acts. Now, let's come back to Acts 14, because now Paul leaves town again, and he comes to another place, and that's called Lystra. He's gone from Antioch to Iconium, Iconium to Lystra. He's still somewhere in the middle of Turkey today. And in Lystra, well, most of the story of Acts 14 takes place, and we're introduced to a few people. One of them's in verse 8, a man who is a cripple. Another one is later on in verse 13. He's a priest of Jupiter, or Zeus in Greek. And there's actually a couple of other people that are here in the story of Acts chapter 14, which aren't mentioned in the chapter here. Now, if we come across to Acts 16, when Paul comes back to Lystra in a few years' time, we're introduced to a few people who heard Paul in Acts chapter 14. Acts 16, verse 1. Then came he to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there, named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman, which was a Jewess, and believed, but his father was a Greek, which was well reported of by the brethren that were at Lystra and Iconium. So when Paul comes back to Lystra, there's an ecclesia there, there's a group of disciples, and one of them's called Timothy, Acts 16, verse 1, and his mother is there too, and his grandmother is there too, we find out in the book of Timothy, and their names are Lois and Eunice. And we can read here about his father in verse 1 as well, and he was a Greek, and he probably wasn't a disciple. So there's a few other names that we can put next to this preaching of Paul in Acts chapter 14. So let's come back to Acts 14, verse 8. And perhaps one interesting thing here is that we don't read now that Paul goes straight to the synagogue. So in Antioch, he went straight to the synagogue. In Iconium, he went straight to the synagogue. We know from Romans that it was really important to preach to the Jews first. That's firmly fixed in his head. He comes to Lystra, and it doesn't say anything about going to the synagogue. So any ideas why he didn't go to the synagogue here? There wasn't one. I think that's a pretty good answer. Probably there wasn't a synagogue. So how many Jews do we need to form a synagogue? Anyone know? Anyone know the Torah? Traditionally, the Jewish law required 10 Jewish men to form a synagogue. If there were less than 10 men, they couldn't build a synagogue. So there are Jews there, but there's not many. We've got Timothy, we've got Lois, we've got Eunice. So we've got 2 women and 1 man who is there. And we know that Timothy's mother was a Jewess, but she married a Greek. So maybe she did that because there weren't many Jews in this place. They couldn't form a synagogue. They didn't have their own community. So Paul finds individual Jews in the town to speak to. We know he definitely did that because Timothy's converted. But he doesn't go to the synagogue, probably because there wasn't one there. But in verse 8, he does find a man who can't walk. A man in Lystra. Now, does anyone remember who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. Does anyone remember the occupation of Luke? Doctor. Doctor of some sort. A physician, yes. So he's very interested in health. And when he writes, he's very, very precise in the way he describes people's conditions. Have a look in verse 8. If I'd written this, I would have said, there was a man who couldn't walk. But have a look what Luke writes in verse 8. There sat a certain man, this is a specific person that everyone in town knew. He's impotent in his feet, and he's a cripple from his mother's womb, and he's never walked. So he tells us the same thing 3 times in a row, so that there can be no doubt that this man had never, ever walked. It's not someone who stepped on a nail and has a sore foot. This is someone who has never walked before. He has no hope of walking. Even if he was here today and he was down at a fancy hospital on North Terrace, they could not make him walk. He'd never walked in his life. And this man in verse 9 listens to Paul speaking, and Paul sees that this man has faith, and he decides to heal him. And he says in verse 10, "Stand upright on thy feet," and immediately he's healed. He leaps and he walks. That's something that no doctor can do today. This is a miracle. This is divine intervention. This is really remarkable. Have a look back in verse 3. God has been very careful when he sends out the apostles to preach this message about his Son, to give them the Holy Spirit so that they had some evidence that God was working with them. They could do really remarkable things, and these miracles were witness that God was at work. And that's just what happens in verse 10, and that is just what the people conclude in verse 11. The people saw what Paul has done, and they lift up their voices, and they say in a foreign language, the speech of Lycaonia, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." This is a pagan area of Turkey. These aren't Jewish people. They worship the Greek and Roman gods. And they see in this miracle evidence that the gods are at work, and they rightly conclude that, well, something divine has happened, but what they haven't got quite right is which God is working. So they know that one of their gods is working, but they haven't connected it to the God of the Bible yet. And this is who they thought they had seen. This man here, this is a real photograph from the 1st century AD. I found it on Wikipedia. And this one here is Jupiter, or Zeus. I think your version said Zeus, yep. So Jupiter is the Roman name, and Zeus is the Greek name. They're the same god. Here's Zeus. He is the god of the heavens, the one with the lightning, the one who's in charge of what goes on. And this one here, that's a photo of Mercurius, or Hermes. And he is the divine messenger. And you can see here he's got this comic hat on with wings. That's to symbolize he's the messenger. He can fly through the air, he can take messages, and particularly he speaks those messages when he delivers them. And this is the Greek god of eloquence. And they hear Paul speaking, and they think he is the Greek god of eloquence. This is a really remarkable preacher that they have heard. Somehow they think that these gods have come to visit. And perhaps they particularly pick on Zeus because Zeus was the god of their town. Have a look in verse 13. The priest of Jupiter, which was before their city, brings oxen and garlands unto the gates and would have done sacrifice. So here's the god Jupiter, and outside the city there would have been a wonderful marble block carved into the shape of this man. And that was the center of their worship. And now they think he's come to visit, and they start preparing sacrifices in verse 13. But in verse 14, Paul and Barnabas hear about this. Perhaps they heard in verse 11, but they were speaking in a foreign language, so they couldn't quite follow what was going on. But now it's really, really clear. They can see the priest coming, they can see the oxen, they can see the garlands. Something's not quite right. They're trying to worship Paul and Barnabas. And now they respond in verse 14. They see this, they rip their clothes, and now they have a message to these people in verse 15. Sirs, why do ye these things? We also are men of like passions with you, and preach unto you that ye should turn from these vanities unto the living God. So they're very clear, we're not divine. We're not gods. We're flesh and blood just like you. And we want you to turn away from worshipping blocks of stone. We want you to worship the living God. And they particularly point out in verse 15 that the living God has created everything. And that was a really remarkable thing to say to these people, because the Greeks had a god for everything. Zeus is the god of the heavens. They had Neptune, who was the god of the seas. They had another god for the god of the land. They had another god for every tree and every animal and every living thing. They had gods for all of these things. And Paul, at this moment in time, doesn't try to argue with them and say, well, Zeus isn't quite right, and neither is Neptune, and neither is Hermes. He simply says, you're kind of right, but you've got the wrong God. We've come preaching the God who has made everything, and therefore he must be greater than all of the other gods. And then he goes on in verse 16. God has done a few remarkable things. Verse 16. There's something about the God of the Bible. Verse 16. Who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. There's something really remarkable about the God of the Bible, and that is, number one, he's created in verse 15. But number two, in verse 16, he gives people choice. And that is a remarkable thing. That's not what the Greek gods did. They punished people directly for their actions. The God of the Bible sometimes does that, but mostly he gives people the choice. But then in verse 16, he has done something else. He's left a witness of his work. He left not himself without witness, in that he did good and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. The rain came down today on everyone, irrespective of whether or not they believed or they worshipped blocks of stone. On Saturday morning, last weekend, we had a wonderful clear day of sunshine. Everyone felt the sunshine. The most horrible people in town and also the most saintly. God gives good gifts to everyone, and he does that to make us stop and think. Firstly, about his creation, and secondly, about his character. This is something very, very unique about the God of the Bible, and Paul wants us all to think about that. And in verse 18, the people stop their sacrifice. But at the back of the crowd, behind the people that Paul is speaking to, there's another group of people, and they're described in verse 19, and it's the Jews from Antioch and Iconium. They've followed Paul and Barnabas right through Turkey, they've found them in Lystra, and now they're stirring up the crowd in verse 19. And they convince them to destroy Paul, and that's what they do. In verse 19, they stone him, they think he's dead, they drag him out of the city, and they leave him near a pile of stones. A terrible fate. And I think perhaps verse 20 is again divine intervention. While Paul is lying there, bleeding, he stands up with the disciples all around him in the most remarkable way. And then he does something in verse 20 that I don't think I would do, and that is he walks straight back into the city to be with the disciples. And then the following day, he moves on to another city called Derbe. So, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, where Paul is stoned, and now the journey goes on to Derbe. And there's a few things that happen in Derbe. Verse 21, they preach to the city and they teach lots of people, but we're not told who they are here. Now, if you come across to Acts chapter 20, we're introduced to at least one of the disciples from Derbe in verse 4. Acts 20 is a couple of years later. Paul's on another missionary journey and he gathers together with him some disciples to travel with him. And in verse 4, this is who he takes with him. There accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe. So this man here, Gaius in Acts 20 verse 4, was probably converted back in Acts chapter 14 verse 21. And that's really as far as the journey goes. That's sort of the extent that Paul travels in his first journey. He's come from Antioch to Cyprus. He's traveled right across Cyprus up to Turkey, to Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And now it's time to go home. Now, again, if I was Paul and I was here and I wanted to get there, Antioch, which is where he left from, I probably would have gone like this. Particularly when Paul was born here. He knows this area really well. He's got lots of friends there. He could easily have gone straight to Tarsus and then across to Antioch. But Paul doesn't do that. He does the exact opposite. Have a look in verse 21. He goes right back to Lystra, where he was beaten up, and then he goes back to Iconium, where he was chased out of town, and then he goes back to Antioch, where he was chased out of town. He goes right back into danger, which is a remarkable thing to do. And if you look in verse 22, it tells us exactly why he did this. He went back to these cities because in each of those places he has left a small group of disciples who are experiencing the same persecution that Paul has experienced. And he goes back to speak to them and encourage them and strengthen them. In verse 22, he confirms the souls of the disciples and exhorts them to continue in the faith, and that we must, through much tribulation, enter the kingdom of God. Now, in verse 22 there, that word exhorting is the word encouragement, but it's also where we get our word exhorting from. The exhortation that we have every week right here comes from Acts chapter 14. It's all about encouragement. We get together as a group of disciples, and somebody stands here and somebody encourages us to grab hold of our faith and not let go. That's what Paul did. That's just where our practice comes from in the book of Acts. And one of the key messages here is to hang on to your faith and also remember that troubles will come, and those troubles are required to perfect us for the kingdom of God. So let's keep our hands here and come across to Romans chapter 5. Because Paul experienced an enormous amount of tribulation in his life. An enormous amount of tribulation. And he also speaks about it a lot. He thought about why it was happening in his life. Why do terrible things happen in our lives? Why do bad things happen because of the faith that we have? Paul thought about that a lot because he experienced persecution. Romans chapter 5, have a look at what he writes in verse 3. Not only so, but we glory in tribulations also, knowing that tribulation worketh patience, and patience experience, and experience hope, and hope maketh not ashamed, because the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Spirit which is given unto us. So Paul could see where in the broader scheme of discipleship tribulation fitted. Tribulation leads to patience, and patience leads to experience and hope and appreciation of the love of God. We will never fully appreciate the love of God without tribulation. Now, it's really easy for me to say that because we live in a country where persecution doesn't happen much, and my life has been very, very blessed. So if I stand up and talk about tribulation, it's easy not to listen. But have a look in Acts chapter 14, verse 22. Just imagine in your mind the Apostle Paul going back to Lystra and Iconium and Antioch, 3 cities he didn't have to be in, 3 cities he had been chased out of, and in Lystra he had been stoned. So he's standing there, and he's probably covered in bruises. He's got black eyes, he's got teeth missing, he's got blood on his face. And Paul is saying, tribulation is helpful in God's scheme to develop our faith. I think they would have listened to Paul much more than they would have listened probably to any of us here if we were giving the same words of encouragement. But once they'd finished, in verse 23, Paul does something else. He ordains elders in every ecclesia. So we've got preaching that happens at the start of this chapter, we've got groups of disciples, and now in verse 23, they're referred to as churches or ecclesias. We're starting to get a body of believers together, and Paul very carefully ordains elders over these ecclesias, and many versions, literal versions, will say that they elected elders over the ecclesias. So Paul has gone back to create these bodies of believers called ecclesias, and he's carefully putting a structure in place for them. Elders are elected, exhortation happens in a regular way, and in verse 23, they come together to pray as well. And that's really where we as an ecclesia get our practices from as well. We come together regularly to encourage each other about the word. We come together to pray, and we have, in a few months' time, an election for the elders which will guide our ecclesia. All of that happens because it happened in the book of Acts, described in Acts chapter 14 and other places as well. So once that's happened, in verse 24, Paul continues his journey. He goes through LYSTRA, ICONIUM, Antioch. He comes back down here to the coast, to Italia and Perga, and then he travels back to Antioch in verse 26, which is where they started. And in verse 27, they do something that's remarkable as well. They get the whole ecclesia together and they share what's happened in the missionary journey. Again, just like we do in this place, we've heard about Tanna, we've heard about Fiji, we've heard about the Philippines, we've heard about Japan, all of these places where people preach the gospel. When they come back home, the group of believers gets together and they share what's happening in this place, just like is described here in Acts chapter 14. And that really brings us to the end of the story in Acts chapter 14. So hopefully you've got something down on your handout here, working through the story. Perhaps there's a few things that stick in my head from this chapter about preaching. Firstly, Paul's preaching was really persuasive and bold and eloquent. He convinced people. He got out there and he spoke with a loud voice that made people sit up and listen. And it was controversial sometimes. Some people threw him out of town, but it worked. And ecclesias were formed in lots of different places. And in Acts chapter 14, I think the other thing about the preaching is he very carefully crafts his message to the people. He's talking to a group of people who believe in gods of wood and stone. He's got about 30 seconds to speak to them, and he comes up with a very persuasive case about why they should stop what they're doing and rethink their position about the gods they were worshipping. That's a very, very powerful skill to have. The people that were converted, we saw Timothy, we saw Eunice, we saw Timothy's grandmother Lois as well. We also saw Gaius, who was converted in this area too. There's lots of individuals converted in Acts chapter 14. Maybe one of the most powerful things for me in Acts 14 is about ecclesias. There are so many things about how ecclesias run which are hidden away in Acts chapter 14, and they really are why we should be doing the same thing today. We should get together regularly to encourage the faith of each other. We should get together to pray. We should have elders elected to guide us together as an ecclesia, and we should be very active in preaching and sharing that preaching work together in what we do. And I think the group of believers here does a pretty good job at following those patterns along with other things as well. And perhaps something about the apostles. The apostle Paul Something I love from this chapter is his courage in going right into persecution, even though he knows it's coming, and continuing to speak the word. And the other thing I love is the fact that Paul placed so much value on the people that he spoke to. He's ready to go back into the firing line to care for the people he has preached to. And he does that over and over and over again. He loves these people and he wants their faith to grow. So, one last slide to finish off with. In verse 27, Paul and Barnabas get back to town in Antioch, and we're given one line of summary of all of Acts 13 and 14. This is what they have to say to the ecclesia. This is what they report. God has opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. That's the most important thing in Paul's mind. And that seems a bit unusual, but let's remember, to the Jew first and then to the Gentiles, all of this has been about the Jews, and now in Acts chapter 14, the tide turns, and the gospel is going to a very, very different group of people, and that's the Gentiles. And it starts to happen a lot, over and over again, after Acts chapter 14. And that was a really difficult thing for the group of believers to come to grips with and to work with in their ecclesias. It led to lots of friction and discussion and debate about how that was going to happen. How could we have the Jews and the Gentiles holding the same faith in one room together? I think most of the New Testament talks about that friction and discussion. And in Acts chapter 15, the whole chapter is about how believers as a group can vehemently disagree and come together and talk about those differences and come up with a productive way to move forward together as a group, as an ecclesia. And I think your next class will be on Acts chapter 15. So you've got a very exciting chapter looking at how our faith can grow even when there's disagreement in the ecclesia. Thank you.
In teaching us the good news from Acts chapter 14. So thank you.